When the government goes too far, the Founders Remedies for federal overreach. What I'm going to do in this short video is describe the ingenious ideas that our Founding Fathers came up with for government that might go too far. What do you do when government has exceeded its authority? Well, they had a solution to this. Our Founding Fathers came from one of the greatest generations, maybe the greatest generation in our history. These gentlemen were geniuses. They also had a biblical worldview, which I think is what gave them such wisdom in the construction of the government, at least the construction of the government that they put together. Now, I'm not saying that our Founding Fathers were all Christians. That's probably not the case. Definitely that's not the case. But the one thing they did have, and I think this is true of all of them, is that they had a biblical worldview, even if they didn't necessarily believe it, because they were all educated with a biblical worldview, and so they had a certain view of the way reality is, and they had a view of what kind of government would function best in the reality that we find ourselves in. So let me begin with just a basic. Given that our Founding Fathers had a biblical worldview, what does the Bible say about government? What exactly is the role of government? In other words, why do we need it? Well, here's the primary reason. It's the restraint of fallen human nature. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of references. If you're in my class, you already know these. If I have never had you as a student, I'm sorry for you. But you can look these up if you'll simply read Romans chapter 13 and then 1 Peter chapter 2, I think it's verses 13 and 14. You will see the role of government. The role of government is to commend righteousness and to punish unrighteousness. Or another way of putting it is government mainly is supposed to punish the evildoer or the wicked. This needs to be here because we as human beings have a fallen human nature. With the very first sin, we inherited this corrupted human nature from our ancestor, Adam. And so the role of government is to restrain fallen human nature. Now, okay, this makes sense. You got to have something with the power of the sword to coerce and to kill if necessary, to keep wickedness from going too far. Now, there's a little dilemma that occurs whenever you try to put this into place. So you need government with enough power to enforce the laws. Somebody has to have enough power to wield the sword, as Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2 tell us. That makes sense. But now if you're a thinking person, as our Founding Fathers were, there's a problem that comes on the heels of this. So government needs enough power to enforce laws, but wait a minute, government is made up of sinful people. So how do you on the one hand have a government that you can use to restrain evil, but then it's made up of people who are evil? What do? Well, here are the remedies of the Founding Fathers. One, and this you should have learned probably by the 8th grade if you were paying attention in your government or civics class, they created a constitution that has built into it checks and balances. That is, the three branches of the federal government, the executive, legislative, and judiciary, all have some oversight over one another. For example, if Congress attempts to pass a law that is unconstitutional, the president can veto it. If the president commits high crimes and misdemeanors, Congress, specifically the House, can impeach, and then the Senate can vote to remove. And then you also have some power with the judicial branch. If it is an unconstitutional law or an unconstitutional act by the president, then the courts have the power of judicial review, where they can strike down a law or strike down an act by a president. and call it unconstitutional. So those are checks and balances. That is this built-in mechanism to restrain the federal government. It pits the three branches of the federal government against one another to keep the whole thing in its proper boundaries. But our founding fathers didn't stop there. Now, often in civics class, that's where you stop. Oh, checks and balances. But our founders went even further. And for some reason, teachers of American history and government don't like to talk about this next part. What we clearly see with the Constitution, and certainly with the Articles of Confederation, which was our very first federal government, really it was a confederacy. I would go so far as to say that the Constitution intended to create a confederacy as well. But what you had with the Constitution is sovereign states balancing the power of the federal government. In other words, the individual states that entered into the compact, which was the Constitution of the United States, had their own power. And this was to be a balance with the federal government, or I should call it the central government, because really the whole thing is considered a federation, where you have this interplay of states and a central government. And so if you take the time to read the founding documents, you will see that this is exactly what our founders had in mind. They did not have in mind this big blob of a government that we call the federal government that represents the whole people. Not the way at all. The central government was created by the states. And that's the way it was supposed to work, and they were supposed to balance one another. Now, specifically, how was this balance to take place? Well, first, the Constitution itself restricted the federal government. The central government was only to do what the Constitution spelled out that it could do. Now, that's not how our leaders look at it at all today. Today, their view is, well, if the Constitution doesn't say I can't do it, then I can do it. But the original understanding, and what I mean by original is when it was ratified, then you get somebody who was a liar like Alexander Hamilton who totally distorted it, but that's another issue. The original understanding was that the central government could only do those few and specific actions spelled out by the Constitution. It's what we call limited government. Well-defined, limited powers of the central government, which you know as well as I do, they totally exceed today. Why? Because our government is not constitutional today. It's almost totally unconstitutional in the laws that are being pushed on us every single day. But originally, that founding document was to restrict the central government, or what we'll call the federal government. Now, what else? Well, again, if you appeal to the Constitution itself, it looks like there's much more power to the states and to the people, respectively. And all you need to do is read the 10th Amendment. And the 10th Amendment, and I'm just going to say it in a really general, basic way, it's saying that whatever power is not delegated to the central government is retained by the people, by the states. And so it leaves it open. In other words, if the Constitution doesn't address it specifically, then it's a power retained by the states and the people. And let me give you an example of this. Education. Education is not something that's the purview of the central government at all. And so therefore, it is left to the states. Another example would be marriage, which has become an issue in our age. Does the Constitution say anything about marriage? No, it does not. And so when you look at the issue of same-sex marriage, gay marriage, that never ever should have been discussed by the U.S. Supreme Court, because at best it is a state issue. The 10th Amendment says that those powers not delegated to the central government are retained by the states and the people respectively. And so the central government doesn't have ultimate power. Now, a third way to balance the power between the central government and the states is something known as interposition. Interposition, well, let me give you an example of this. There is a great hymn, and I know that churches don't sing hymns much anymore because we're much too sophisticated for those hymns. Actually, it's because we don't have the brain power to follow what they're saying anymore. So we've got to have praise and worship choruses that make us feel all good. Anyway, there's an old hymn called Come Thou Fount of Many Blessings. And there's one line that says, Christ interposed his precious blood. Now, what does interposition mean when Christ interposed his blood? Well, to interpose means to come between. And so what that hymn is telling us is that Christ's blood came between us and something else. And what did his blood come between us? Or what is it that was coming to us that his blood interposes? Well, it's the wrath of God because of our sin. And so the blood of Christ comes between us and the wrath of God, which we justly deserve because of our sin. And so that's what interposition is. It's a go-between. It's something that goes between one person or another. And it could also mean, in this case, between one government and another, or actually, in this case, it means coming between you, the private individual, and the central government. States were to interpose themselves on your behalf against the federal government if it needed to. In other words, originally the founders understood that the states could act in their best interest and in the best interest of their people to stop the federal government if they needed to. And that's what interposition is about. Now, there are three primary ways that our founders understood that states could do this. Okay, so here are the remedies. Here are the things the states could act on to stop the central government from overreaching. The first one is something called nullification. Nullification is where you counteract a federal law with a state law. In other words, if the federal government passes a law that is unconstitutional, then states can stop it by simply passing a law that says that in their state you don't have to follow that law, or there's some kind of penalty if you act on that federal law. And it's called nullification. This was first bandied around with Jefferson and with James Madison. I'm not going to get into the history, but anyway, before the 1800s ever occurred, they were already talking about nullification. And so there's an argument that people raise against nullification. They'll say, well, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't nullify a federal law because the Constitution forbids it. And typically they will cite Article 6 and something called the Supremacy Clause. And so Article 6, Paragraph 2, which is the Supremacy Clause, says this. And it seems to say that you can't pass a state law that counteracts a federal law. But look closely, and I've underlined something which you have to take into consideration. So here's what Article 6 of the Constitution says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. Let me translate that. If the federal government passes a law, states cannot counteract those laws with laws of their own. They can't pass a law that's contrary to a federal law. Now, that's the argument that people use against nullification. But here's what they will not tell you. What does this mean in pursuance? Here's what it says. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof. In pursuance thereof. Pursuance means to put into effect. And so what this really means is that laws that put the Constitution into effect have supremacy. In other words, as long as the law is constitutional, states can't pass a counter law to it. They can't pass a law that's contrary to it. But it leaves open the question, what if the law is not constitutional? What if the central government passes a law and they do not have the power given to them explicitly by the U.S. Constitution? Well, those who promote nullification would say the Supremacy Clause doesn't apply here, and states can certainly counteract unconstitutional laws, and I would have to agree with that because of the specific wording of the Constitution itself. Okay, so nullification, and let me give you an example of that today. Marijuana laws that states are passing today are effectively nullifying federal drug laws. Some states will allow certain firearms, and you don't have to get a background check in certain states. That is nullification. But if you ever meet somebody who strenuously push against nullification, here's the nuclear option. Ask them this: what about fugitive slave laws? Oh, you see, in the United States, whenever Congress on several occasions, when they were trying to come to terms with the whole slavery issue and the territories and all that stuff, they would pass fugitive slave laws, which said that if you lived in a non-slave holding state, that if a slave escaped from a slave state, you had to return those slaves to their masters. You were compelled by law to do it. And so in free states, which were northern states, they passed personal liberty laws, which said you do not have to return those runaway slaves. Those were called personal liberty laws. And so if you ever meet anybody who objects to nullification, ask them if they object to personal liberty laws. And ask them, so you mean you think that runaway slaves should have been returned to slave holders by northern states? Well, if you're against nullification, that's what you have to believe. All right? So certainly people who would be against nullification would probably also be against slavery. And I guarantee you they would see that slavery, at least the way that it was done in the United States, was objectively immoral, and they would agree that those slaves should not have been returned if those states did the right thing by passing personal liberty laws. So there you go. There's your nuclear option. Use it. Another thing that states could do to interpose themselves between the private citizen and the central government was maintenance of state militias. This is the entire reason for the Second Amendment. Now, I would like to say that the Second Amendment is for your right to hunt or shoot at targets or collect guns or even personal safety, but that's not what the Constitution says. Look what it says. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Your right to own a gun is to maintain a free state with the use of a militia. Our founders understood that one of the ways that you can stop the central government from going too far is by having a state militia. In fact, James Madison, in one of the Federalist Papers, said, "It is inconceivable to think that the central government would ever have an army stronger than state militias." And so, no worries. We've got this Second Amendment that upholds our right to bear arms so that we can have a state militia, so that we can stop an overreaching central government. That's what James Madison had to say about the issue. Of course, today, you know that's laughable. States cannot stop the central government's army. In fact, even National Guard groups, which are supposed to have replaced militias, are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. But that's not the way this thing was intended to work originally. All right, so state militias, one of the ways that the states could interpose themselves. And then third, and please restrain yourself from associating this word with racism and slavery. To do such reveals a total ignorance of history. But secession is one of the remedies against an overreaching central government. Secession means that a state removes itself from the compact of the Union. And secession has been part of our core identity since the very beginning. And how do I know this? Well, just look at the Declaration of Independence. This is what Jefferson said. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce the people under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. What was he talking about? Well, at that point, we did not have states, we had colonies, and they were under the authority of England. And England was depriving them of their rights as Englishmen. So what did they do? They seceded from England in what we call the War for Independence. And also, if you go on and read the actual Declaration of Independence, get to the very end of it, you will see that what happened is that sovereign states seceded from England, not this blob of an entity called the United States as we recognize it today. And so secession was part of our American identity from the very beginning. The Constitution, again, let me appeal to it. The Constitution actually says nothing about secession. And because it says nothing about secession, we can therefore conclude that states have the power to secede. How do we know this? Well, I've already mentioned the 10th Amendment. Look what it says. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Here's what it says. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. By the way, it says nothing about secession, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Translated, if it's not in the Constitution, it is the power of the states or the people. So the states, therefore, have the right to secede. They have the right to remove themselves from the Union. Now, in case you do not believe me on this, and I don't expect that you will, if you've had typical history classes, let me give you a couple of pieces of evidence just to verify this. Just so you know, whenever the Constitution was ratified, 3 of the states that ratified, namely Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York, in their ratification documents stated that they had the right to withdraw from the Union if it became harmful to their interests. In other words, they stated that they had the right to secede if they needed to do so. So, nobody objected to this. Everybody thought this was perfectly legitimate. Let me give you another piece of evidence. You may not know this, but when Thomas Jefferson was president, the New England states had a secession movement. They did not, first of all, they didn't like Jefferson. They didn't like his policies. They did not like his tariff, which hurt their trade. He embargoed England. And so New England had a secession movement. And here's what a guy named Timothy Pickering wrote when he was speaking about New England secession. Now, Timothy Pickering was not some nobody. He was Washington's Secretary of War, and he was also Washington's Secretary of State. So he probably knew what he was talking about. This is a founding father. And so speaking about the secession of New England, here's what he said. The principles of our revolution can point to the remedy, a separation. This can be accomplished without spilling one drop of blood, I have little doubt. Now, I know that the Supreme Court ruled secession unconstitutional. That does not mean that they are correct. They actually have no constitutional bounds, or I should say authority, to make such a claim. It's very clear from early on that our founders expected that secession could be a remedy to an overreaching central government. If you don't like what the central government is doing, if you feel that that it's depriving you of your rights as a state or as citizens, then you can simply leave. And usually the threat of that very thing would cause the central government to come around, and they would work to compromise. But then, of course, what happened is that in 1861, The central government decided to squash secession through power, through the use of arms. And because of that event, secession has been looked upon as something that is unconstitutional, and it's actually been looked upon as something that for some reason people view it as immoral. I think because they attach it to racism and slavery and that sort of thing. But secession is an idea that is built in to the Constitution, to the founding documents. It was the mindset of our founding fathers. Okay, so that's what I want to leave you with. When government goes too far, states are supposed to interpose themselves. So that'll do it for this video.